If you spent the last 3 years watching relocation videos, you already know the pitch. Lisbon got expensive, so go to Porto instead. Same coastline energy, same port wine, same UNESCO tile-covered streets, for a fraction of the price. That pitch was true once. The question this episode asks is simpler and less comfortable. Is it still true in 2026? Or is Porto just running 6 years behind Lisbon on the same trajectory? To answer that, we need two separate ledgers, not one. The first belongs to someone born and working in Porto, paid in euros that were never meant to compete with a foreign salary. The second belongs to the remote worker who lands with dollars, pounds, or a Northern European paycheck that converts favorably no matter what the local job market pays. Both people are looking at the same rental listings. They are not looking at the same city. Start with the local side, because it sets the ceiling on what affordable can mean here. The average gross monthly salary in Porto sits at roughly €1,629. After tax and social security contributions, that lands somewhere close to €1,200 to €1,300 net, though take-home pay swings by profession and contract type. And Portugal's National Statistics Office reports both regular and total earnings separately, which is worth knowing if you ever cross-check a number and it looks different from what we're using here. The national minimum wage for 2026 sits at €920 gross per month, paid across 14 installments. Though a small number of sources this year cite €870 instead, an older 2025 figure that hadn't yet been updated when those pages were published. We're using €920, the rate confirmed as of January 1st, 2026. €920. That's the wage floor a meaningful share of Porto's service and hospitality workforce is living on, in a city where a one-bedroom apartment in the center rents for closer to €1,000 a month. Sit with that gap for a second, because it's the gap this whole episode is built around. Now the other side. A remote worker earning even a modest foreign salary, say €3,000 to €4,000 a month, unremarkable by US or Northern European standards, walks into the exact same rental market as someone earning €920. They're not competing for different apartments. They're competing for the same ones, in the same neighborhoods, viewed on the same listings. One side has 4 times the purchasing power of the other, and the market doesn't know or care which side of that gap you're standing on. It only knows what you can pay, and it prices toward whoever can pay more. That's the mechanism. Everything else in this episode is what that mechanism produces. Let's get to rent specifically, because this is where Porto's reputation and Porto's numbers have started to diverge. A one-bedroom apartment in the city center currently rents for somewhere between €900 and €1,200 a month, depending on the neighborhood. Push outward to areas like Bonfim or Paranhos, and that range drops to roughly €700 to €900. A two-bedroom apartment in a central location runs €1,200 to €1,700, with €1,400 as a reasonable midpoint. On a price per square meter basis, Porto rents currently average around €18, and that figure has climbed roughly 3% over the past year. A moderate increase, but a consistent one, in a market that was already tight to begin with. Here's where the neighborhood matters more than the city average. Cida Fita, the historic center, and Foz do Douro near the waterfront sit at the top of the rent range. Ramalde and Campania sit at the bottom. That's not a small spread. It's often the difference between an apartment costing €700 and one costing €1,200 for a comparable unit, purely based on which side of the city you're willing to live on. For the remote worker, that's a lifestyle choice. For a local resident whose job, family, and social network are anchored in a specific part of the city, it's much less negotiable. Basic utilities for an average apartment, electricity, heating, water, and garbage, add roughly €140 a month. A single person's non-rent monthly expenses, covering food, transport, and incidentals, land somewhere between €800 and €1,000. Add those together with a central one-bedroom rent, and a single person living centrally in Porto in 2026 needs somewhere in the range of €1,700 to €2,100 a month just to cover the basics. Before savings, before travel, before anything resembling discretionary spending. Compare that to the local net salary of €1,200 to €1,300. That's the first crack in the Porto is still cheap narrative. For someone earning the Porto average, a centrally located one-bedroom apartment on its own can consume 70 to 90% of take-home pay. That's not a comfortable margin. That's a math problem with very few solutions. Smaller apartment, shared housing, a longer commute from a cheaper suburb, or a second income in the household. Numbeo-style benchmarks are already showing Portugal's overall living costs as roughly 40% lower than the UK when rent is excluded. But the moment you add rent back into that comparison, the gap narrows sharply because Portuguese wages didn't rise anywhere near as fast as Portuguese rents did. Now the property side, and this is where we need to slow down, because two different numbers get thrown around interchangeably online, and they are measuring two different things. The first number, Idealista's asking price for property listed in Porto City currently averages somewhere between 3,900 and 4,064 euros per square meter, depending on which month's report you're reading. That's an asking price, what a seller is requesting, not what a buyer actually pays. The second number, Portugal's National Statistics Institute, using actual completed transaction data for the wider Porto metropolitan area, put the median transaction price at roughly 2,305 euros per square meter as of the fourth quarter of 2025. Those two figures are not describing the same market and should never be quoted as if they are. One is a wish list, what sellers hope buyers will pay in the city proper. The other is what actually closed, averaged across a broader metropolitan area that includes cheaper suburban parishes like Vila Nova de Gaia and Matosinhos alongside the pricier city core. A YouTube script that quotes the 4,000 euro number as what Porto property costs, while implying it reflects typical buyer experience, is quietly inflating the story. A script that quotes the 2,300 euro number without noting it covers a wider geographic area than just the city itself is quietly deflating it. The honest number sits somewhere between those two, closer to what a buyer in the city itself, rather than the surrounding metro area, actually closes at. And market trackers cross-referencing both sources currently estimate that figure at roughly 3,400 to 3,900 euros per square meter within city limits for early 2026. 3,900 euros per square meter. That's the working estimate for buying inside the city of Porto today. At that rate, a typical 90 square meter apartment lands around 306,000 to 350,000 euros, a median and an average that differ because a small number of very expensive luxury sales pull the average upward without reflecting what most buyers actually pay. The most affordable pockets of the city, Campania, Ramalde, parts of Paranhos, currently sit closer to 3,100 to 3,500 euros per square meter. And Campania in particular has seen prices soften by roughly 9% year-on-year, the one part of this market currently moving in the buyer's favor. The most expensive, Foz do Douro, Neveguild, the riverfront belt, sit above 4,800 euros per square meter and are still climbing, driven by limited resale stock and a growing share of international buyers specifically targeting the coastal corridor. That's the second crack. Porto property has roughly doubled relative to household income over the past decade, according to OECD analysis published earlier this year. A trajectory Lisbon walked 5 to 7 years ahead of Porto, and one Porto is now walking at speed. One side of the ledger, a local buyer trying to qualify for a mortgage against a salary that averages 1,629 euros gross, in a market where even the cheapest central neighborhoods sit above 3,000 euros per square meter. The other side, a foreign buyer converting savings from a stronger currency, for whom 350,000 euros might represent a modest apartment rather than a stretch purchase. Same listings. Same city, structurally different transactions. Transportation, by contrast, is one of the few places where Porto's numbers still hold up against the reputation. The city runs on the Andante system, a single integrated fare structure covering the metro, the STCP bus network, and CP's urban trains across the whole metropolitan area. A monthly pass covering the full metropolitan area costs 40 euros. A more limited pass covering just the 3 central zones costs 30 euros. Students under 23 ride for free, funded by the Metropolitan Authority, And as of April 2026, the region approved a pilot program extending free transport to residents over 23 as well, though the rollout details were still being finalized as this episode was written. A single ride from the airport into the city center runs about €2.75 on the Metro's Violet line, a roughly 30-minute trip. For comparison, that's less than the cost of a coffee and a pastry at most central cafes. €40 a month for unlimited transport across an entire metropolitan area. That's the kind of number that doesn't need a myth check. Healthcare tells a similarly two-sided story, though the sides here are less about local versus foreign and more about public versus private. Legal residents, local and foreign alike, once you hold a valid residence permit, get access to Portugal's National Health Service, the SNS, which covers general practitioners, hospital care, emergency treatment, and subsidized prescriptions, funded through general taxation. Co-payments for standard services run €4 to €18 per visit, with exemptions for low-income patients, chronic conditions, and pregnancy. Portugal's healthcare system currently ranks 21st globally on Numbio's index, with particular strength in Lisbon and Porto specifically, where facilities are newer and English-speaking staff more common than in rural regions. But, and this matters for anyone actually planning the move rather than just watching from a distance, SNS registration does not satisfy the health insurance requirement for either of Portugal's main residency visas. Both the D7 and D8 visa applications require private or international health insurance before you're eligible to apply, regardless of your eventual right to use the public system. Basic private plans from Portuguese insurers run €25 to €60 a month per person. Comprehensive plans, €80 to €150. Premium international coverage with home country repatriation, €150 to €300 and up. For most single applicants under 40 with no pre-existing conditions, a basic to mid-tier plan in the €30 to €60 range is the realistic entry point. A genuinely small line item compared to the housing numbers we just walked through. Which brings us to residency itself, because this is where the myth check framing of this episode earns its name most directly. Portugal currently offers two main non-EU residency routes relevant to the kind of person watching this video. The D7 visa, sometimes called the passive income visa, requires proof of at least €920 a month in recurring passive income, pensions, dividends, rental income, royalties. That threshold is directly indexed to the national minimum wage, which is exactly why it rose alongside the wage increase at the start of this year. Add a spouse, and the requirement rises by €460 a month. Add each dependent child, €276. The D8 visa, the digital nomad route, for people earning active income from remote work, sets the bar considerably higher, at least €3,680 a month, a figure set at exactly 4 times the national minimum wage by design. Both visas require proof of at least €11,040 in savings, arranged accommodation in Portugal, and that private health insurance we just covered. €920 a month for the D7. €3,680 a month for the D8. For times the distance between them, and that ratio is not an accident. It's a deliberate policy choice linking what a foreign resident must prove to what a Portuguese minimum wage worker actually earns in a month. There's a second layer worth flagging honestly rather than glossing over. Portugal's nationality law changed in 2026, and the changes are still settling. Parliament reproved a revised law on April 1st with a 2/3 majority, and the President signed it on May 3rd. The core effect extends the required period of legal residency before naturalization eligibility to 10 years, up from the previous framework. Separately, family reunification rules under a related 2025 law may now require the main visa holder to complete 2 years of residency before sponsoring family members' own applications. Both of these are recent enough and specific enough to individual circumstances that anyone actually planning around them should verify the current text directly with a licensed immigration lawyer rather than relying on a summary video. This is squarely in confirmed policy, but check the fine print, territory, not settled common knowledge. So where does that leave the actual comparison this episode set out to make? On one side, a Porto resident earning the city average, roughly €1,629 gross before tax, Watching rent alone consume the better part of that income if they want to live centrally. Watching property prices climb at a rate their wages simply haven't matched, and increasingly weighing a longer commute from Romuald or Campania against a shorter one they can no longer afford near the center. On the other side, a remote worker clearing the D8 threshold of €3,680 a month, for whom that same central one-bedroom at €1,000 represents a manageable fraction of income rather than a majority of it, who converts savings from a stronger currency into a property market that still looks cheap by Western European standards even as locals watch it price them further from the center every year. Neither side is imaginary. Both are living in the same city, at the same time, reading the same listings, and arriving at completely different verdicts about whether Porto is affordable. There's a tile you'll see all over this city, hand-painted azulejo, blue and white, sometimes centuries old, mounted on building facades that have survived earthquakes, fires, and 600 years of ownership changes. Somewhere in this episode's opening, that same tile appeared with a small, almost incongruous price tag hanging off its corner, a placeholder for a number nobody had confirmed yet. We can put a real number on it now. Whatever building that tile sits on, if it's in the historic center, is currently worth close to €4,000 per square meter to a buyer with foreign savings, and roughly 4 times a local worker's monthly wage for every single square meter of it. The tile hasn't changed in a century. What it's worth to the 2 different people standing in front of it has changed completely. So the question this episode leaves open isn't whether Porto is still cheap. That framing was probably never precise enough to answer honestly in the first place. The real question splits in 2, and it splits along exactly the same line as everything else in this episode. For the person earning euros in Porto, is the city you grew up affordable and still the city you can afford to stay in? Or are you already commuting from somewhere your parents never had to? For the person earning dollars or pounds and watching this from somewhere else, is a rent that looks like a bargain to you actually a bargain? Or is it simply the price the local market can no longer set on its own?